to begin with. So the kind of progress we saw in the 1990s and the early 2000s, in the latter period, it's not to say that there hasn't been improvement, but that for some reason that improvement has leveled off, and it's leveled off at levels that are fairly high. It's not as if we've kind of gotten to where we need to go, and consequently you can say that, okay, job done, so we don't have to worry about this anymore. And that, against that backdrop, I want to talk about what lessons we can draw from the ICDS, which, unlike the PDS, is an intervention that's really targeted to kids. It's targeted to children under 5, who are the ones who are most vulnerable to undernutrition, and also where as adults we may have the hangover of undernutrition when we were children and when India was not perhaps doing as well. When we look at for statistics for children under 5 now, these are children who have been born in the modern era, in the post-liberalization era, in the era that has seen rapid rates of economic growth. So to what extent has the ICDS enabled these improvements, or has it been largely ineffective? And I'm going to break down my discussion to 3 major questions. The first is, what are the determinants of utilization? Is it that the ICDS is there but people don't use it? If people do use it, to what extent does it improve nutrition, in the sense to what extent does it improve food intakes of young children? Especially because the ICDS has the explicit objective to bridge the gap between requirements and intake. And finally, to what extent has the ICDS improved anthropometric outcomes? I was trying to fix all the typos. I clearly didn't get all of them. There's a word missing here, obviously, at the end of that slide. I apologize for that. And I will caution, so these are the 3 main questions I want to address, and I will caution you that this is based on primary survey data. This is not based on secondary sources. So primary surveys are rich because they allow you to explore issues in greater depth, but then they also have the drawback that they're limited to a particular geography, in this case, Eastern India, sometimes Bihar, Jharkhand, Orissa, et cetera, et cetera. So turning to the first question, one of the first things we wanted to look at is, it's all very well to say that the Supreme Court mandate and get any benefit from, whether it's a supplementary nutrition component, whether it's the vaccinations or the health checkups and so on. And what we found, to our pleasant surprise, is that actually these services were available. There were about 33 centers that we visited across 3 states, and pretty much all of them had the services being available. So we've clubbed them into health investment or food being supplementary nutrition. But when you ask the households, are you aware that there is this provision available for your children? And these are only households who have children in the relevant age group. What you find is that actually only 71% of households said that, this exists. So if I'm not even aware that this is an entitlement that I can take advantage of, it's not clear how you would expect utilization rates to be very high. So only about 71% say that yes, they know that these services are available, and households that perceive this discrepancy between what's actually available and what they say they think is available are likely to be belonging to scheduled caste households and belonging to landless households. So having said that, are we at least seeing adoption rates or utilization rates of 71%? And the answer is no. So if you take the 100 minus that, so about 60% of utilization is what we're seeing in these states, not the 71%. So if we know, if people know that there's something that they can utilize, it looks like utilization rates are pretty high, but otherwise you'd say that utilization rates are only about 60%, and you'd worry whether they're sort of demand side factors. So at least at one level, we've tried to indicate that if there are supply level constraints, it doesn't seem to be so much in the physical availability of a Anganwadi worker, physical availability of food, vaccinations, and so on. It's about perceptions of availability. So clearly, lack of awareness is going to be a constraint to enhanced utilization. And at one level, this is an easy win, right? To say that you need to do awareness campaigns and to focus especially among communities that are less likely to be aware of their entitlements, that's an easy thing to do. As you'll see as we go along, some of the other implications from this work are not that easy to translate into policy change. So the next thing is, obviously, there's also demand side factor at play here. So what is that demand side factor? Why don't households utilize services from the ICDS? And so we tried to estimate this conditional on perceived availability. So in other words, we didn't do this taking just demand side factors, but saying that conditional on the fact that the household knew that they were entitled to take their child to the ICDS center, why didn't they do so? And the most important factor that comes out of that is caste. So if the Anganwadi worker is not of the same caste as the household, then they are far less likely to utilize the ICDS services. And at one level, this is not that difficult to understand because caste, the first sort of manifestation of caste taboos is on the subject of food. And so this is not a surprising result. But in terms of what you can do in terms of policy, it's a lot harder to do. And remember that this is despite the fact that an ICDS center is actually located within a locality, within each locality, within a village, and localities within villages, even villages which have multiple castes, tend to be caste specific. So despite that, the caste of the Anganwadi worker seems to matter a lot to the decision to utilize these services, and that's not so easy to change through a policy intervention, except to say that perhaps make sure that you have decentralized appointments of Anganwadi workers to belong to the same caste. So do you entrench caste hierarchies or do you help them? I don't want to go there. We did not find any gender bias in utilization. And there was some evidence that ICDS, to have a more number of ICDS centers might help, but it doesn't seem like there's physical distance is not that much of a constraint. The density of the ICDS seems to, at least in Eastern India, seems to be fairly high. So having now looked at utilization, now conditional on utilization, what impact has the ICDS had on food intakes? How much are the children getting from participating in the ICDS? So the ICDS program stipulates that you must get 500 kilocalories of energy per day. It doesn't matter whether you're a 1-year-old, 2-year-old child, or whether you're a 5-year-old child or you're a 4-year-old child. You're supposed to get about 500 kilocalories of energy per day and about 12 to 15 grams of protein per day. That's the ICDS mandate, as I'm sure most of you knew. It does not mention micronutrients, but we also know that having a diet quality which is high, which means that it's rich in micronutrients, is actually important for ensuring that we see rapid improvements in stunting and underweight that are a problem even today. The other fact about the ICDS is that the mode of the transfer varies by age group. So if the child is between 6 months and 2 years, the mother is given take-home rations and said that, feed this to your child. She's given extensive counseling to say if this is meant for your child, et cetera, et cetera. And that's understandable because they've just learned to walk. The 2-year-olds are toddlers. It's hard to make them sit at one place and give them a meal in a centralized location. And for children who are older, up to 3 to 6 years old, 6 years of age, for example, they're actually given a cooked meal at the Anganwadi center. But what is important is that the value of the food, or whether it's a drain transfer or whether it is the cooked meal, the value is about the same. It's about 100 rupees per household per month. Now, why is it important to look at whether the ICDS has an impact on food intakes? Now, there could be some leakages saying, for instance, that this is how much they're supposed to provide, but actually there's already some leakages, and so what the Anganwadi centers are providing is only 200 calories of rice and wheat and maybe 2 grams or 3 grams of protein. That there may be leakages that even though the meals are getting provided, they don't have the nutrient content that is mandated. But there's also another kind of leakage that might happen, which is that as a parent, I'll say, well, my child is getting a meal at school, so I don't need to provide her with lunch, correct? So, and if the value of the caloric content or the nutrient content of the meal that I provide my child at home or would have sent her to the preschool center with is the same as what is being provided at the Anganwadi center, then you don't expect any impact on total caloric intakes. Okay? So what you want is for the ICDS, the meal that's being provided at the Anganwadi center, to add on to the caloric intake that the child would have received had, if she had stayed at home. So depending on the leakage, and this is not really a leakage, but this is behavioral, depending on what's happening at home, either there's complete substitution or there's no substitution, in which case the child who goes to the Anganwadi center is getting 500 calories more than the child who's not going to the Anganwadi center, or the truth may lie somewhere in between, that there is some substitution but not complete substitution of the food that's provided provided at home. So what we find is that these are causal estimates using, as you can see, the matching techniques that we used. And what we find is that, in fact, the impact on 3 and 6-year-olds is between 130 and 160 calories per child per day. So this is not 500, it's substantially less. And it's not less because of leakages in the Anganwadi center. In fact, the Anganwadi centers are providing about 80%. So they're not providing 500 calories, but they are providing close to 400 calories per meal. So the difference between 400 calories and 130 to 160 calories comes entirely because of what is happening within the child's home for the other meals. The Anganwadi center is only providing 1 meal per day to a child. So there's no evidence of energy substitution from energy intakes at home, or there's some weak evidence depending on what method you use. There's an increase in protein intakes and there's an increase in iron intakes, but there doesn't seem to be any impact on vitamin A intakes as a consequence of providing these meals to the child at the Anganwadi center. But instead, when you turn to the 1 to 3-year-olds, these are children who are given, whose mothers are given rations to take home in the form of rice and wheat and pulses, you find that there's no impact at all. If anything, there might even be a perverse impact on food intakes. So it seems to suggest that as far as very young children are concerned, where the mode of transfer is take-home rations given to the mother, there doesn't seem to be any impact of the ICDS on child nutrition. Now, I have to acknowledge, as I'm sure most of you will have picked up, that there's a confound here. So I'm attributing something to mode of transfer which may well be due to the age. It might just be that even if somehow you could pick up a 1-year-old, 2-year-old and sit them down at an Anganwadi center and feed them, that's very difficult to do, as all of us who've seen children that age can attest. It's not clear that their caloric intakes would have also gone up. So there is a confound between method of transfer and age of the child. But nonetheless, to my mind, these results are quite suggestive. And it's also an age group where, therefore, it's very difficult to handle how do you improve their energy intakes, especially because there seems to be evidence that the counseling that was supposed to happen did happen. So if you believe that the mothers were given the ration, but then they weren't told that this is meant for your child, so she behaves as if this is just something for the entire household, so that entire ration gets shared by everybody else. That didn't seem to happen. There was actually an active effort at counseling. So in terms of implications, we have to recognize before we overinterpret these results that even when I monetize this value of transfer, this is actually fairly modest relative to what the household is spending on food. And we know that the energy income elasticities are 0, certainly at the household level, but there's also evidence that suggests that that operates at the individual level. Now, despite age confounds, it suggests that transfer might matter. It's not very clear that states like Andhra Pradesh, which actually provide eggs and so on, whether this is also true of these transfers. In other words, do you see leakages in states where in Andhra Pradesh, for example, every 2 weeks the mother is given 14 eggs and told that this is actually meant for your child. I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that this does or does not leak out from the child to other members of the family. And turning finally to anthropometric outcomes, here I don't have any age disaggregation because the sample size isn't large enough to be able to distinguish the 1 to 3-year-olds from the 4 to 6-year-olds. What we find is, again, that conditional on utilization, conditional on awareness, sorry, there is a clear impact on weight for age Z scores in terms of utilization or no utilization. And if you look at this number here, full versus partial utilization, which suggests that full utilization means that they're not only getting the supplementary nutrition, but they're also participating in the health services and the vaccinations and the counseling and a whole host of preschool packages that the ICDS is supposed to deliver. Those households which actually participate in both services, both sets of services, as opposed to just having the supplementary nutrition, versus those households which take their child only for one of the 2 sets of services, either for the vaccinations or for the food, there's also strong evidence of of impact on weight for age Z-score, suggesting therefore that complementarities exist in the utilization of ICDS services, and therefore an exclusive focus on, or on a near exclusive focus on food as the main sort of service of the ICDS is perhaps not as warranted. However, on the height for age Z-scores, there is some evidence of impact, but that's very sensitive to what method you use to calculate impact. So if ideally you want these estimates to not change depending on methodology, but at least for height for age, I'm less willing to say that the ICDS has had a substantial impact on height for age. On weight for age, it does seem to have made a difference. So these impact magnitudes, by the way, are much larger than what has been suggested in the literature by papers with Lakshin or Monica Jain, among others. And I'm not surprised by that, because those studies were done at a time when the sort of rapid expansion in ICDS services post the Supreme Court mandate of universalization, that hadn't taken place. But again, it's not clear if you had the ICDS, even the supplementary nutrition component of the ICDS, if it had a stronger focus on diet quality, such as the Andhra Pradesh example of providing eggs and not just wheat and rice for take-home rations, it's not clear whether that might have seen a better improvement in height for age Z-scores as opposed to just weight. So the weight results are not surprising given the focus on calories, given the focus on getting food out. But the height for age, we know from the medical literature, is far more sensitive to diet quality, assuming that the quantity of diet is sufficient. I'll end now with just a few words on the PDS, although that wasn't in my mandate, primarily because I think the PDS has traditionally been seen as sort of an income support, smoothing, so it has an important role in smoothing out consumption over the year. But any number of studies have shown that if you look at its impact on calorie intakes, we don't see it. We have a large number of studies, whether you look at total energy intakes or whether you take anthropometric outcomes, at least until, let's say, 2010, 12, all the literature basically said, don't expect the PDS to do anything to calorie intakes. Of course, it doesn't address the counterfactual of what would have happened to calorie intakes had there been no PDS. But it's not as if those who participated in the PDS had much higher food intakes than those who did not. I must emphasize, for those of you who will say, but you haven't cited X, Y, and Z paper, I'm only considering those papers which have taken the issue of causal identification seriously. And those of you who understand what that means, I'll leave it at that. Those who've done sort of OLS kinds of regressions without looking at identification, I'm not considering those papers, although those papers do obviously suggest that there's impact even on among the poor. But what's really heartening is that there's some more recent evidence, some work by Krishnamurthy et al. Just focused entirely on Chhattisgarh, that's forthcoming in the Economic Development and Cultural Change, as well as some recent work that one of my students has done that suggests that post-expansion, so if you look at the NSS data from 2009-10 and 11-12, there's a distinct impact on calories, but the impact on diet quality. Earlier in the morning, we were talking about the Gangapadhyay et al. Paper suggesting that there was no change in food intakes from getting a cash transfer, some modest evidence of improvements in diet quality. In my view, that paper, it's about how you interpret a paper, doesn't actually provide convincing evidence of improvements in diet quality. The evidence is suggestive. But here also, there's some modest evidence to suggest that diet quality improves as a consequence of this rapid expansion. But really what you do see is an improvement in calorie. And the protein is also coming, by the way, from the grains. It's not coming from the pulses. And so that suggests that actually when you have a credible PDS system with expansion in coverage, with certain supplies, and it does have an impact on at least calories, but let's not expect it to have an impact on protein straight away. So I will stop there and take questions later after.